It's the Inside Scoop Virginia, all the news Virginians want to know. Now here's the host of Inside Scoop Virginia, George Burke.
Good evening and welcome to Inside Scoop Virginia. I'm George Burke. My guest today is Senator George Barker. He represents the 39th District of Virginia, which encompasses part of Fairfax and part of Prince William County. George was elected this past year. This is his first term. It was his first session in office. I'm glad to have him back. We had him on as a candidate. I'm glad to have him back now where he can talk about the session. George will be plain spoken. He spent a lot of time in Richmond over the years dealing particularly with health, a lot of health and health facility matters. George has a bachelor's and a master's in health-related fields from Harvard University. He serves on the Education and Health Committee, the General Laws and Technology Committee, Privileges and Elections Committee, and Rehabilitation and Social Services. For those of you who remember, George won the 21st Democratic seat on election night last year, which gave the Senate a majority of Democrats, number one, and number two resulted in the election of our own Dick Saslaw as Senate Majority Leader. So it was a very historic moment. George, welcome back to the show. I'm glad to have you.
Thank you very much. My pleasure to be here, George.
Just for a start, give us a bit of an overview of your experiences down there and how you sort of saw the Senate session take place as a whole. I know we talked before the show and there weren't any real surprises for you. You were very familiar with the operation of the Senate and the General Assembly overall. But just some impressions for our viewers.
Well, as you said, I'd been down there working in the General Assembly a good bit over the last 20 years or so, so I had a significant advantage over some of the other newly elected legislators in that I knew the people, I knew the processes, I understood sort of how you got things done, knew what the expectations would be, and that was obviously a tremendous benefit. What was significant was we had a shift in power in terms of the Senate, and that it had been a Republican majority and it became a Democratic majority. So it was a change in terms of who the leadership was, a huge change when you sort of looked across the committee chairmanships compared to what it had been previously. Northern Virginia has a substantial number of committee chairmanships. Of the 11 chairs of committees in the Senate, it used to be all 11 were white men. 7 of the 11 now are women, 4 are African American. So it's a very diverse group. And it's, I think, really, all of them, I think, provided tremendous leadership this year, and it was a pleasure to work with them.
It more reflects, I think, the demographics of Virginia.
Oh, it certainly does.
Than we saw previously under the Republicans. Well, how about Dick Saslaw? How did he do as Senate Majority Leader?
Dick did a great job as Majority Leader. He came in, and we sort of had to feel our way through a few things at the beginning to get our feet wet in terms of how we were going to operate things. But Dick took, I think, the right tone on terms of providing leadership in a couple of ways. One was that in terms of how we operated as Democrats, there were no ironclad rules that we had to vote a certain way. We discussed things among ourselves, but each of the 21 Democrats was able to vote freely and without real pressure in terms of how we wanted to do. That really, I think, empowered us because it gave us the ability to represent our constituents, to represent our views, and to do a good job of trying to do the best thing for all of Virginia. The other thing that I think was very striking was that under Dick's leadership, we worked very well, an effort was made to work very well with the Republicans. Unlike what happened in the House of Delegates, there was not a single Republican who was kicked off any committee when the Democrats took majority. The major committees, basically most of them ended up being 8 Democrats and 7 Republicans, so we're not stacked committees with overwhelming Democratic majorities. And those types of things, we certainly tried to give the Republicans every chance to be involved in the legislative process at every step. There was a committee that had a majority of Republicans. There were subcommittees that were chaired by Republicans. So it was we really reached out and did the types of things that I think made it a bipartisan Senate. And I think that was the right thing to do in the end. And it really helped move things along.
There were some reports in the media that the Republicans, that while there was still certainly comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y for our viewers, within the Senate, but there was a little bit more partisanship because they were looking at the future and looking at some of the elections, and they were getting heavy pressure from the House Republicans to tie you guys in knots a little bit. I'm not sure that they were successful, and I agree. I think I did see, still there was a conviviality and congeniality that existed in that process. I'm sure that it surprised, well, it didn't surprise them. I'm sure the tenor of the Senate changed a little bit with our Senate Majority Leader as plain-spoken as he is, and outspoken as he is.
Well, he certainly is plain-spoken, he certainly is outspoken, but what he also is someone who knows how to work with people. And so he worked very closely with the Republican leadership every step of the way. And that was key to sort of building that trust, that rapport, of letting the Republicans know that they were part of the process just as much as those of us who were in the majority this time. And we needed to try to do the right things for Virginia rather than what was in a Republican interest or what was in a Democratic interest. And I think that really helped us as we worked through the session, and by the end of the session, I think made us a much more unified body in trying to push through an agenda and really help all Virginians.
Plus, Dick Sasslow is very much known as a man of his word.
Yes.
And so when he gave it, they knew it was good.
Yes, they knew it was absolutely good. And actually one of the things that was great was Tommy Norman, who's the Republican leader, is also someone who's known as a man of his word. And so you had two people who both knew that they could trust each other. And that was critical to help him get things moving along.
I want to talk about transportation, but let's talk about the budget first. You guys stayed in for a few extra days to get it done. For a while, it looked like it was all going to unravel, and there was a lot of concern about what was going to go on in the House. But ultimately, it ended up with a budget. While not a perfect document, they never are. They're always somewhere in the middle. Managed to take care of a lot of potential problems that existed on the horizon financially because of the state of our economy and the like. How would you talk to us a little bit about the budget? How did you think the process went?
I thought the process went very well. I was very pleased to be a part of that process, even though not a major person here in terms of not sitting on the Finance Committee or being one of the conferees. But I thought the approach that we took in developing that budget helped lead to a good budget that we came up with in the end. And it was certainly worth it to take 5 extra days to get it right and to do a good job there. So although it would have been nice to have been able to adjourn on time, we ended up with a good product. As a result of the way we went at things there. What I thought was great was that we had a very difficult budget situation for both the current biennium and the next biennium. You put those two together, and the revenues had to be adjusted by about almost $2 billion. So there was significant downward adjusting of revenues. That could have led to all kinds of problems. It could have led to draconian action being taken. It could have led to an abandonment of principles and abandonment of initiatives. What we did was that we passed a budget that cut us spending a good bit in a number of areas, but did it for the most part as softly and as gently as we could without damaging services to people, came up with a balanced budget, did it without raising taxes, and did it while we still were able to take modest steps, not huge steps, but modest steps that were very positive in a whole host of different areas. If you look at mental health, if you look at some of what we did in education, you look at what we did with public safety, you look at how we handled relationships with local governments and our support for our counties and cities. In all of those areas, I think we ended up coming up with a very good budget, one that we should be proud of.
One of the issues that is, I hate to say near and dear to Northern Virginia, but something we are constantly grappling with and something we are reminded of every day is certainly our transportation mess.
Yes.
And you folks took the right step, I think, in the eyes of most Virginia citizens in repealing the so-called abuser fees. But obviously in doing so, it left a large gap in the funding for the transportation program. Then we saw the regional authorities, transportation authorities, ruled unconstitutional, which negates their taxing authorities in the specific regions of the state where we have the most problems, I would guess. So as a result, we have a framework for what needs to be done, but no money to do it. And there's some talk you folks will go back into session again for a transportation bill. And I just want to tell the viewers that our phones are open. If you'd like to talk to Senator Barker, you can call us at 571-749-1166. One of the things I know that you folks did some work on was at least dealing with the maintenance, getting something working. You have to come up with money for the maintenance of the highways. But how are we going to deal with transportation?
Well, let me just review a couple of things.
Okay.
One was I was pleased to be one of several members of the Senate who were co-sponsors of the repeal of the abuser fee bill.
Mm-hmm.
That was a bill that turned out to be an absolute disaster. A lot of us had recognized it a year ago, but it had seemed to have a political momentum of its own, and a number of people, including the person I beat, had been supportive of that type of measure.
Correct.
In the end, the abuser fee bill produced very little revenue. So it ended up generating only a tiny fraction of what they had anticipated. So getting rid of it did something good, but it had very little impact in terms of total revenues coming into the Commonwealth.
I know a lot of people on the highways slowed down from 76 to 74.
Well, they may have been slowed down from 76 to 74, but what the study showed was the average speed had not decreased overall. Yeah. So there was no impact in terms of behavior there in terms of what the average speed was, no decrease in accidents. There were none of the positive benefits that people had been touting that would occur from that. So it was, I think, a good day that when we got that passed, and we got it passed in a way that the money that had been paid in will be refunded now, so that there will be no one who will suffer as a result of what was clearly bad legislation that was passed a year ago. There were two major developments during the session that I think do create some significant issues for us, particularly for us here in Northern Virginia. One was the announcement coming out of the Federal Transit Administration that they were questioning seriously questioning whether they were going to provide the support and the $900 million needed to get the rail built to Dulles. What happened was that the administration, the governor and his people, I think, took a very positive, aggressive approach on that, came out and have worked with the congressional delegation and with the federal officials and have responded to the issues that have been raised in a way that I am optimistic that we'll be able to get that back on track and keep that moving. I'm confident we will get rail to Dulles. We may not get it quite as fast as we should have gotten it, but we will get rail to Dulles, and I think things are moving very positively in that fashion. The second issue was the Supreme Court decision, state Supreme Court decision, unanimous decision, tossing out all the fees and taxes that had been imposed by the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority as a result of the bill that was passed last year. That does have a significant effect upon the money available for us here in Northern Virginia to address our transportation problem, both for transit as well as for highway construction. There may or there may not be a special session held later this year. If a special session occurs, it's likely to occur in May or June, but there is no guarantee that there will be a special session. Well, the position that we have taken in the Senate is that we need a special session to address two issues. One is to deal with the funding in terms of highway construction monies, particularly for Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads, where they're the biggest problems. And we need to have, if it's going to happen, we need to have it happen as a result of the state stepping up, the General Assembly stepping up, taking responsibility ourselves and saying we need to do something about this and coming up with a plan that we're the ones acting on it, rather than pretending to pass it, doing nothing and pretending to pass it off to a Northern Virginia Transportation Authority or some other group. The second thing we need to do is address as you touched on, the maintenance funding formula.
We're going to come back to the transportation issue in 2 minutes. We have to take a break. There's a lot more to talk about on that issue and a lot more to talk on a lot of others. These issues involve you folks. It's your government at work right here in the state of Virginia. So we'll be back in 2 minutes. Thanks for watching.
How far would you go to help someone? Would you go to the end of your driveway? Would you cross a street? Would you cross an ocean? To a place 6,000 miles from home? And how long would you go? Would you go for a week? A month? A year? Would you go for 2 years? Would you go if you could use your knowledge to teach someone, and in the process, maybe learn something yourself? Life is calling. How far will you go? Peace Corps.
James, don't forget your helmet.
Will do.
Not a helmet. Your bike helmet.
Oh, okay. Hi, I'm James Thrash with the Washington Redskins. On the football field, a helmet is an important piece of equipment. I also wear another helmet that's just as important. A bike helmet. It's the most important piece of equipment you'll have the next time you're out on your bike. Wear yours and make sure your kids do too. Safety first with the Skins.
Monica and her friends want you to know that you should never get near a dog when it is eating, playing with a favorite toy, or sleeping. It's really important to make time for exercise and games and keep your dog's vaccines up to date. Never leave a dog in a small, confined space. This can make dogs aggressive like Monica. If you follow this advice, you and your dog can play safely and happily together.
Now back to the Inside Scoop Virginia. Call in live and let your voice be heard. Here again, your host, George Burke.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop Virginia. My guest today is Senator George Barker from the 39th District, which is part of Fairfax County and part of Prince William County. When I so rudely interrupted him for a commercial, we were in the middle of a discussion on transportation issues affecting Northern Virginia, and you were talking about these regional transportation authorities and the time to come up with a plan that adequately funds transportation.
Yes. And the position we've taken in the Senate is we need both a statewide approach to it and also regional approaches to address the issues that we have in places like Northern Virginia. The critical issue we have at the statewide level right now is we don't have enough money, anywhere near enough money to cover our maintenance costs for our highways. In Virginia, there's the basic transportation fund, which is used first for maintenance, and then there's what's known as a transportation trust fund, which was set up in 1986. Legislation was passed then, and is designed to be used for road construction, for transit, and for other types of things that are really going to expand our capacity and improve our transportation system. We don't have enough money, as I said, in the maintenance fund. So what we're doing is we are, in effect, stealing more than $1 million a day out of the trust fund, which is designed to be used for new construction and for transit, and transferring it in to cover maintenance costs. What that means is we're gradually drying up all the money that's available for new construction. We need to get a stable source of funding for the maintenance fund that's going to be adequate to cover it. So that we're not having to constantly borrow and steal money from the Transportation Trust Fund that is not repaid, that then diminishes our ability to address our problem and has a statewide impact. So the position we've taken in the Senate is that we need to address both the statewide issue, including the maintenance side of things, as well as the Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads regional issues.
There was a valiant effort made in the Senate to pass a gas tax. It was a very modest increase that I think most of us consumers wouldn't even notice the way gas prices are rising and jumping around. I believe it was a penny a year increase for 5 years, which would have ultimately resulted in a 5 cents increase. And I notice as I'm in the district and I'm in Maryland and other states that our gas tax is not really very high in Virginia compared to some of these other states. What happened? We lose it in the House, or where was the...
Yes, the House did not pass that, so they were not willing to take the steps to try to help us restore the funding for the maintenance fund to be able to cover maintenance from the maintenance fund so that we could use the money that's designated for new construction as well as for transit.
I don't understand how a legislature can go back to his constituents and say, I'm not supporting any increase in transportation funds, even though, particularly if it's Hampton Roads or Northern Virginia, even though, you know, transportation's strangling you, and at some point it's going to start strangling our economy.
Well, to a certain extent it already is. It's not a huge strangle on the economy yet, but it's already impacting the economy here and also in Hampton Roads. We've already seen situations where companies that have offices here in Northern Virginia as well as elsewhere and around the country, when they're expanding, they're choosing in many instances to expand elsewhere rather than in Northern Virginia simply because of the transportation situation, which makes it more difficult for them to attract and retain their employees. And so that is already starting to have a negative effect. The types of jobs that we would get in those situations are the types of jobs that are very good, high-paying jobs that are good for our economy, that would help address a lot of the other issues that we have here, and we're already losing out on those. The same thing's happening in Hampton Roads. Data came out the other day where it showed that Hampton Roads actually had a decrease in population between 2006 and 2007 for the first time in recent memory. Both regions are already being choked off, and the economies, which have really been the economies that have driven Virginia to one of the top states in the country in terms of business and economic standing and personal wealth, those are being choked off, and that's not good for anybody in Virginia.
At one point, of course, I was living in Northern Virginia, and one of my sons was going to school at Old Dominion, so I'd go from one hot spot to another and get stuck in traffic on 95 and N64 all the way down there.
Yeah, as long as you weren't in the tunnel, when you got stuck, you were all right.
I've been stuck on the bridge. I have not been stuck
yes.
in the tunnel, but I've been stuck on the bridge leading to the tunnel. Just quickly, one of the issues that was contentious over the last two sessions, but came to a head this time, was the payday lending issue. You had one group that basically wanted to kill them. You had another group that said you have to leave it the way it is because we're basically providing a service to those who are not able to get credit from any other alternative. The Senate fashioned a compromise, as did I guess certainly the House was involved in this, but it looks like it's a pretty good compromise since neither party was happy with the result, which tells me that's good legislating in the long run. How did it turn out?
I thought it turned out, I thought it was good legislation that we came up with because in the end, as you said, neither side was completely happy. We reached something that really, I think, struck a middle chord there that really was responsive to the types of concerns that people had about what payday lending institutions were doing to some people who ended up being in a cycle of debt as a result of their use of that credit. But we also kept it alive so that that option is available for people who really need it. It's available in a much more limited way than it was previously, and there are a lot of limitations in terms of the amount of interest, for example, has now been limited to 36%. So in addition, we build into it some things to help people who get in a difficult situation in terms of being able to pay it back. That they end up having up to a 90-day extension to be able to pay it back with no additional interest charged during that period of time, and then they can't go back into the market for 2 months there afterwards. So people can only go through 2 sessions of that in an entire year. So it's not the type of thing where people are getting many loan after loan after loan after loan. And I think what we came up with is something that really is in the best interest of the people who access that service.
Well, that was good legislating because as we had talked about this before, I was concerned that if it was totally eliminated, you took away an option that some people
if it were totally eliminated, what would happen is people would not, they would go somewhere else.
Yeah.
And there are some of these offshore lending institutions that clearly operate in a way that really rip people off. People would end up using pawn shops much more and often end up in a situation where they end up in much more difficult circumstances. There are there are certain things that you can get on the internet. They're not all legal, but people access them. Those are clearly not as well structured and don't have the protections you get with the payday lending industry. So the concern was that if we're shut down completely, that where people would end up turning are the types of things that would be much worse for them. And so I think what we've done is kept the industry there to make it available for people who need it, but really has some significant restrictions on it. I think it's much less likely that people are going to be caught in that cycle of debt that really creates problems and has lasting effect upon their lives.
I think it was an appropriate compromise, and I think it was something that provides some strong consumer protections, but at the same time keeps a program alive.
Right.
It looks like, well, it doesn't look like, later this month, later in April, we're still in March, but later in April, you folks are going back for a veto session. And I'm not sure our viewers all understand that, but it's quite simple. The governor takes actions on a variety of bills, and he can actually offer some substantive and substantial amendments, my understanding is. He can veto legislation, or he can just leave it alone and it becomes law. I guess nobody has a real feel. We haven't heard too much from the governor in terms of what he's going to do on a lot of these pieces of legislation. I don't know how much of it is considered controversial on their part. what do you see with the veto session? I know I'm asking you to rub a crystal ball here, put yourself in the governor's mind, and certainly I know you have a relationship with the governor, but I don't think anybody quite knows what he's going to do in this session.
Well, you got it right. Nobody knows quite what he's going to do, and so I don't know exactly which bills are going to be vetoed and which ones he's going to propose amendments to. Clearly, there'll be some that will be in those two categories, and actually, before we adjourned, we already dealt with, I think it was 3 bills that he had vetoed and a whole host of bills where he had proposed amendments. He's a very hands-on governor in terms of taking a very close look at each bill, deciding whether or not to sign it or whether to veto it or whether to propose amendments. And he's been more aggressive than many other governors in tweaking legislation, trying to improve it as it goes through the process. Most of those end up being, the types of amendments that he proposed end up being passed by the General Assembly. And I would expect that would continue to be the case. Certainly, I think all but one of those that he proposed making amendments, where he proposed amendments, were adopted by the General Assembly when we acted on them in March. So we'll see what comes out of that. I don't expect anything earth-shattering, but I think there will be some changes that I think will be good for the Commonwealth. The other 2 things that we either will or may do at that time when we come back for the veto session, one is pass a bond package, because that was one of the things we did not get done when we were there during the 60-day session. We moved things pretty far along in terms of reaching consensus on things, and I think the approach that we ended up taking jointly with the House of Delegates is a good approach that can move projects quickly, can start construction of a number of projects in July, and hopefully we'll get enough funding of things to really make a big difference. There are a variety of things for higher education, including a number of things for George Mason and Northern Virginia Community College that are on the list. And they also, what they did was they took a look at in terms of what were the highest priority projects, which actually I think benefits those of us in Northern Virginia because of our growth. Particularly with higher education, a lot of the projects are likely to come to Northern Virginia. So I'm very optimistic about that. And then the third thing we may do is that there were some disagreements as it related to appointing some of the judges. And we'll see whether we can resolve those, that's another responsibility of the General Assembly.
I was reading an article just the other day that even individual senators wield quite a bit of power in terms of the appointment of judges in the way our system. It dates back to Reconstruction in terms of the system and how it works. So that will be interesting. We only have about 40 seconds left before we break, so I don't want to rudely interrupt you again. Let me just ask you a quick question. Did you have fun?
Oh, I certainly did. It's a lot of work, but it's a big challenge, but it's something I felt very well prepared for. I had a great staff working with me that I really appreciate, a couple of aides as well as an intern, and I think we were able to do a lot of good things. I felt very comfortable working with other legislators, and I think we moved things along.
Well, that brings us to the halfway mark. We're going to take another 2-minute break. Thanks for staying with us. 571-749-1166 is our number if you're not out there watching basketball tonight, and we'll see you in 2.
Go to jail for a gun crime, and your family serves a sentence with you.
I'm Bob Costas, and I've been broadcasting sports for a long time. Much of what I do is ad-libbed, but still one of the most important aspects of my job is being able to write. Narrations, essays, commentaries. It's essential to express those thoughts and concepts clearly and concisely. Good writing is essential for almost any career. And with today's advanced technology, the National Commission on Writing reports that the need to write well has never been more important. Writing is everybody's business.
Sure, my neighbors Gene and Louise, they may be superheroes with superpowers, but that doesn't make them so super at saving energy and money.
Honey?
I may not be able to harness the power of the elements, but I save significant cash and help the environment with appliances, electronics, and windows featuring the Energy Star label. So discover your own energy-saving superpowers. Go to ase.org/consumers.
Mom, Dad's making fondue again.
Now back to the Inside Scoop, Virginia. Call in live and let your voice be heard. Here again, your host, George Burke.
Welcome back. Tonight, my guest is Senator George Barker. George, it's always great to have you on the show. Time flies. You're a very knowledgeable person, and we cover a lot of stuff. You have extensive background in healthcare and healthcare management and the like, and it's clear from your committee appointments that they're relying on you for that background. And much of your time spent in Richmond in past years was working on these very issues. I know that you got a piece of legislation passed this year that establishes a healthcare directive registry.
Right.
Explain that to me.
All right.
It's a pretty highfalutin title. I don't quite know.
Well, the title is more highfalutin than actually the concept here. I think people are, by and large, familiar with living wills. Living wills are things where you give direction as to what happens if you're in a situation where you can't make decisions about your health situation. What happens if you're heading in a terminal situation? How do you want to be treated? Do you want extraordinary measures applied, or do you not?
My 87-year-old mother-in-law just did one.
Oh, okay, yes. Well, what the bill that I got passed, and David England from Alexandria had a similar bill, and so we worked together on this to get it done. He's a delegate, and so he was able to work on the House side, and while I was doing the things in the Senate. What this would do was set up a registry that would be maintained through the Department of Health that would be available so that anyone in Virginia could have this registered with the Department of Health. It would be available online for emergency department physicians and for hospitals, so that if you or I were, say, in an accident in some other part of the state, we were in a coma or somehow otherwise were incapacitated in terms of being able to make decisions, they could go online and find out who do we want to be able to help make those decisions for us when we're unable to make them, and how do we want to be treated in certain situations, so that information is readily available to the physicians and the hospitals and the staff that have to make those treatment decisions and take the treatment actions. And they're doing what we want us to do, or relying upon the people that we want to be relied upon in making those decisions. So we're going to have that set up. It'll take a year or so to be able to get it phased in and operational, but hopefully by sometime in 2009 we'll have that online. And that will give people the comfort that they know that if they should be in that situation, the person they want to make the decision for them is making that decision, and that their wishes are honored.
Talk to me about some of the other healthcare legislation that the General Assembly dealt with this year.
There was a number of initiatives in healthcare this year, and as you said, one of the advantages that I have, is doing that professionally and having my degrees in healthcare. I come in with expertise, so I'm able to help tremendously, I think, in terms of the Senate in providing that perspective. There's also a physician who was just elected, a pediatric neurologist, Ralph Northam from down in the Norfolk area. And so the two of us really brought some health expertise to the Senate this year. And so what we clearly found on bill after bill, and even on some of the budget situations, was people were turning to us to get our input on those types of things. One of the initiatives that Governor Kane put forward this year was an effort to try to increase access to health care services. There was an increase in terms of Medicaid coverage that will start in 2009 for pregnant women, so that those pregnant women up to 200% of poverty can be sure to be able to access all the prenatal care they need, rather than being put in a situation where sometimes they haven't gotten all the care in the past because they couldn't afford to pay out of pocket, and then you have someone who shows up at the delivery room not having received the prenatal care that she should have received, and that the infant that's born, sometimes suffers as a result of that. We helped address that with that initiative. We substantially increased funding for community health centers and free clinics that are helping take care of people. There were some other initiatives, smaller initiatives that moved forward, including one for dental care services. So we're doing, what I was encouraged by was we took some modest steps, not big steps, but modest steps to try to help people who need access to care services. One of the other major health issues, and it was one that I was heavily involved in this year, was smoking legislation. There are more than 24 states around the country that have passed significant anti-smoking legislation. Virginia's not one of them. We had legislation in this year with a variety of different bills that passed the Senate, and I was on a special subcommittee that reviewed all these bills, some of which would have restricted smoking in restaurants, other of which would have restricted it in all public places, so that people are not exposed to that secondhand smoke with significant health consequences as a result. There are thousands of people who die every year just as a result of that secondhand smoke exposure.
And if we can, and people, employees in the restaurants and employees in other locations.
Yeah, employees, it's really the employees are the ones who suffer most. Employees in restaurants are clearly substantially affected by this, but also employees in work situations or others who work near people who are smoking, who may have some health problems to start out with in particular. They are the ones that are most vulnerable to the secondhand smoke and often suffer serious illnesses and even death as a result of that secondhand smoke. We had some significant legislation that was passed in the Senate this year to address those issues. All those bills, however, were killed in the House of Delegates. We're going to keep at it because it's important that we do the types of things to try to protect the health of the people of the Commonwealth, and we try to make sure that we're not putting them in a situation where their health and even their very lives are affected by what someone else is doing, not their own behaviors.
And it's not a radical move in this day and age, given what we know about smoking and given the track record in some other states, et cetera. You know,
well, and we also have, a lot of restaurants now are going to non-smoking on their own, so they've initiated that. What was interesting was that we had a public hearing one evening. There were, I think, more than 36 people that spoke. There was not a single person who came to that public hearing and said, I smoke and I want to be able to smoke in a restaurant or at work or wherever. Not one. The vast majority of people that spoke came out in support of the anti-smoking legislation. Many of them were employees, particularly restaurant employees, who spoke of the effect that the smoke was having upon how they felt, how they were able to live their lives, and what they felt as their health exposure as a result of that. We actually had, part of what was interesting was the restaurant industry was divided on this. There were some restaurants and the whole Virginia Beach Restaurant Association that said, we want this, because if you try to do it piecemeal, then people are afraid to do it because they're afraid from a competitive standpoint they'll lose out. If it's a requirement and everybody does it, it's not a problem. And what's been shown is that in states where they've implemented this type of legislation, restaurant sales have actually gone up.
I was going to raise that, and even the bars, the bars were particularly worried, a beer and a cigarette, shot and a cigarette. Well, it hasn't happened. I mean, the revenues, the bar revenues and tavern revenues in the states where they've done this don't seem to have declined at all.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are individual facilities that sometimes have been affected, but in aggregate, the actual effect of it has been positive. Because what you then have is people who now stay away because they don't want to walk into that smoky atmosphere. And I can name a couple of those down in Richmond that I saw during the General Assembly session where I didn't really want to go back. Once they know those types of places which are otherwise attractive are going to be smoke-free, they come. And they come and they eat themselves, they drink, they do other types of things, they bring their kids, and actually it's actually been beneficial.
Do the reluctance on the part of the General Assembly, were they looking at it from a civil libertarian viewpoint? Were they looking at it from Virginia's historical background as a tobacco state? Or were they looking at it from a financial, getting the pressure from that segment of the restaurant industry that wanted to keep smoking? Where do you think the pushback came?
Well, I don't know the full details, and different people came at it from different perspectives. So there's a little bit of all those that was in there. What was striking, whereas I think we had a very good open discussion in the Senate, and a substantial majority supported the legislation or different pieces of legislation that came forward, with as much as 28 to 30 of the senators out of the 40 that we have supporting some type of anti-smoking legislation. In the House of Delegates, there was sort of the House Republican leadership took a position against the legislation, so it really never had a chance to get a full discussion and airing on things. Hopefully we'll get there soon, and what several people said to me that the opponents of it are now feeling the pressure, and they understand that this is something that's coming and that we have to deal with it and grapple with this issue and protect the health of the citizens who suffer as a result of this secondhand smoke now.
It has to be a little frustrating sitting in the Senate sometimes and watching how radically different the General Assembly works. Not that I'd want to be in Brian Moran's shoes or some of the other players on the Democratic side in the General Assembly dealing with that, but you got to experience some frustration. You've done all this work, you've put together a good piece of legislation. Often you have bipartisan support coming out of the Senate, and then it gets submarined in the House.
Yes, it clearly sometimes is a little frustrating, and that obviously I was, like other senators, was one who had several of my bills that passed, or in some cases passed unanimously out of the Senate, that then did not get through in the House. I think that I mean, there clearly are some significant differences between the Senate and the House, and those differences by and large existed prior to this year, when we had a Republican majority in the Senate. It's not simply a Democrat versus Republican thing.
I understand.
It's been a difference in philosophical perspective and approach to things in the Senate versus the House. The Senate's always approached things that we're 40 people who are adults and can make decisions and try to work together to get things done. Neither the Republican or Democratic leadership has operated in ways to try to make it a partisan body, to say that everybody has to vote the same way. Unfortunately, that's not been the case in the House. And the House Republican leadership has been much more of a top-down type of thing, with a directive that you will vote a certain way, yes or no, on this particular bill. That I think has stifled free thinking and has stifled discussion. It's stifled a lot of good legislation that would have been beneficial to the people of the Commonwealth. We're making progress in the House, and I think over time we can resolve some of these types of things, and we're going to keep the pressure up and make sure that they have to deal with these types of issues and are accountable for the decisions that they make.
Well, on the political side, a number of us are working hard to continue to try and chip away at that Republican majority in the General Assembly as well. We'll see. It's an uphill battle.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the types of things that may happen. What I hope also can happen is that some of the Republicans start to understand in the House that it's actually in their interest if they work with us to try to resolve some of these types of issues. When they take such an autocratic approach and such a monolithic approach to everything, then I think they weaken their own perspective on things. And we have and I've worked with a lot of the Republicans, both in the Senate and on the House and things. They're good people, they're good Republicans as well as good Democrats. I've tried to take a bipartisan approach to things, and that's the way I want to do it. And it would be a lot easier to do it if the House, in effect, would let that process work.
I don't know how some of these Republicans are able to go back to their constituents. And granted, I mean, their leadership called the shots. I mean, we see the same thing in the U.S. House of Representatives. It's not surprising. But how they're able to go back and respond to their constituents about some much-needed legislation, it just ends up going down the tubes.
Yes. Well, one of the nice things about being in the Senate right now, regardless of whether you're a Democrat or Republican, is that doesn't happen there. We're able to make our own decisions and really operate in terms of what we think is best for the people of Virginia.
We only have a couple of minutes before the break, less than a couple of minutes, but while we're on the whole issue of health care, let's talk briefly about mental health.
Yes.
Obviously, it became a top shelf issue after the tragedy at Virginia Tech and the like. What were you folks able to do in terms of dealing with some of the mental health issues that we face here?
Mental health was one of those things that was, very gratifying to be part of the process to address those issues. And as you said, they got more attention after the Virginia Tech tragedy last year, but actually the General Assembly had already been working on it prior to that, both within the Assembly itself and also with a commission that had been appointed by the Supreme Court justices.
I know you had been consulting with them for some time.
Yeah, I've been working on mental health issues and doing planning for Northern Virginia for the last 6 years. We've had a whole regional partnership that we've worked on and tried to improve services and address a lot of the problems and shortcomings we have in Northern Virginia. So I went down there very familiar with those things. What was gratifying was that there really was a bipartisan approach that was taken this year. It was one of those issues that ended up not being partisan and ended up not being a fight between the Senate and the House. It was one where we worked together on things. And we got additional funding for services, particularly for outpatient services, for some crisis stabilization beds that have been very effective where we've used them in Fairfax County in recent years, that really are going to, I think, benefit a lot of people. And we also addressed our detention and commitment process for when people have serious mental illness and need to be detained in some way, need to be placed within a facility there.
I worry about the added need we're going to have with all these returning veterans having some of the mental health problems they're going back with. We will return in 2 minutes. My guest is Senator George Barker. Hang on, and we'll give you some more information when you get back.
One day, I forgot to throw away my trash after lunch, but then I saw it later when I was playing in the woods. The next week, I went boating with my grandpa, and there it was. I tried to go swimming, but I couldn't because of my trash. And when I went fishing, well, you can guess what I caught that day. So now I always throw away my trash in the garbage can, where it belongs.
One in 8 Americans goes hungry. One idea helped change that. A community started a garden that blossomed into farmers markets. 1 in 6 children lives in poverty. One group of women found an answer by opening a daycare center that their neighbors could afford. Today, 36 million Americans live in poverty, but one by one, people are helping themselves and each other to change the picture of poverty to one of hope. For easy ways you can help, visit povertyusa.org.
Every year, 250,000 Americans are diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease.
My fellow scientists and I are working on treatments and a cure for this deadly disease.
Millions of lives are at stake. Alzheimer's disease affects 1 in 3 families.
We're committed to uncovering the mystery of Alzheimer's.
And we're not going to quit until the job is done.
To find out more about Alzheimer's disease, call 1-800-437-2423.
Only through research will a cure be found.
James, don't forget your helmet.
Will do.
Not a helmet. Your bike helmet.
Oh, okay. Hi, I'm James Thrash with the Washington Redskins. On the football field, a helmet is an important piece of equipment. I also wear another helmet that's just as important. A bike helmet. It's the most important piece of equipment you'll have the next time you're out on your bike. Wear yours and make sure your kids do too. Safety first with the Skins.
Now back to the Inside Scoop, Virginia. Call in live and let your voice be heard. Here again, your host, George Burke.
Welcome back to my show tonight with Senator George Barker of Senate District 39. George, I'd mentioned veterans at the end of the last segment, and I have some real concerns. I mean, I have some nephews and nieces who are over there, and I know several people who've come back wounded, but I also know several people who've come back with brain trauma. And I can only guess at how many. I've seen sort of the post-traumatic stress syndrome from the firefighters' side of things in my years when I worked for the International Association of Firefighters. And we have a lot of people coming back who are going to have some real issues. They may not physically be maimed, although we have some horrible injuries coming back that way as well, but they will have issues that have to be dealt with. And I have, from the news stories I've written and people I've spoken to, I think there's some serious gaps in what we're going to be able to do. I don't think we're going to be able to cope with the full impact of so many people having so many issues related to the war, whether it's what they've seen, whether it's what they've been through. There's a myriad number of reasons. We saw some of it with people coming back from Nam, but not, and that was a problem, but I think that's the tip of the iceberg compared to what we're going to see as this Iraq conflict continues. Is there anything you folks have done or can do in Richmond?
Yes, we have taken, I think, a very significant step this year because it is a real problem, and I'll just correct you on one thing. It's not something that we're going to see, it's something we're already seeing.
Yes. Yeah.
It's real, it's something that's impacting us already. And as you mentioned earlier, I've worked a good bit with the mental health community here in terms of planning for mental health services in Northern Virginia. We're already seeing a lot of veterans with significant mental health issues, often issues that were not apparent by the time they were discharged from the service. So it's not a situation where they had a problem and the service treated them while they were active duty and then discharged them. It's many instances that the problem actually doesn't show up until after discharge. There are sort of 3 major categories of injury that we're trying to deal with, and we need to take some responsibility for them and try to help our veterans. One is the post-traumatic stress syndrome. This disorder syndrome that a lot of people are experiencing. It's a very difficult thing for a lot of people, what they've experienced, what they've seen, the effect of seeing comrades who are seriously injured and killed, as well as what they're seeing in terms of the Iraqi side. And there are a lot of soldiers and veterans who are suffering that. The second category is what you talked about in terms of traumatic brain injury. And actually, one of the things that happens is a lot of these people with traumatic brain injury, just like some of the ones with post-traumatic stress disorder, they doesn't show up until after they're discharged. And it's particularly what's happening is when there are these explosions, which are killing a lot of the people, the soldiers that we lose are killed in explosions. In many instances, there are things that get shaken up inside the head that you don't see while you're on active duty there, and you don't realize how badly you've been hurt. But 3 months, 6 months, 2 years after you've been gotten back from the war, you may start to suddenly have some problems. Mm-hmm. And so in many instances, those brain injury problems aren't showing up until they actually have been discharged. The third, as you talked about, is much more apparent, and that's the physical injuries. There are so many soldiers who have lost limbs and otherwise suffered various serious injuries that if they'd been in previous wars, even in Vietnam, they would have died. Yeah, they're now being saved, but now being saved and having a very difficult situation that they need to cope. What we did this year was we passed some legislation and provided some funding for what's being called the Wounded Warrior Program. The legislation was, the chief sponsor in the Senate of it was Senator Toddy Puller from our own Mount Vernon area, and whose husband suffered from both mental effects as well as loss of both of his legs and 6 of his fingers, and when he was in Vietnam.
Chesty Puller.
Well, Chesty Puller's son, Lewis Puller. Chesty Puller's son. And so she knows firsthand, what that can do. And so she brought forward legislation for this Wounded Warrior Program that's providing funding that will be funded through the Department of Mental Health, mental retardation, et cetera, as well as through the Department of Rehabilitative Services, which deals with more the limbs and the physical side of things. And so we're going to be doing some things at the state level and working with our local governments and local agencies to provide services to these veterans, because we have a responsibility and commitment to be able to do those types of things.
Well, it certainly needs to be done, and the situation, I think, is, I'm glad to hear that, because the situation's only going to get worse before it gets better in terms of the folks coming back. Going back into the political realm for a moment, I think most of our viewers understand the term gerrymandering from Governor Jerry, governor, I believe he was a governor of Massachusetts back in
a couple hundred years ago.
A long time ago. Yeah. And he created, or was the father of creating these districts that have some very unusual shapes. In my years in Congress, I can remember some members having districts where, they were city blocks in New York. They'd be one city block wide for half a mile, and then they would grow again, depending on the type of demographics they were trying to fill in that district. Now, I know there was an effort made by you folks to develop a nonpartisan redistricting plan. I believe there's at least one state, maybe a couple of states that have such plans now, where they're based on demographics more than they're based on politics. What happened? I understand it didn't make it through.
Yes, did not make it through. Hopefully, we'll see whether we make progress next year on this initiative. Actually, a year ago, there was a legislation to have a constitutional amendment to, in effect, set up a totally independent commission that would have the power to do it. It was clear that wasn't going to pass, so the effort this year was to create a bipartisan, nonpartisan type of commission that would propose how the districts would be drawn. And the districts that would be drawn for the General Assembly members ourselves, as well as for the congressional districts. That legislation passed the Senate 33-5. There was a strong bipartisan approach that was taken on it, and it was legislation that was supported by Democratic Governor Tim Kaine and Republican Lieutenant Governor Bill Bolling. So we had strong bipartisan support to get it through. But like some of the other legislation that you referred to earlier, this legislation did not fare so well and was killed 3-2 on a party line vote in the House of Delegates. We're going to keep at it.
In one of their subcommittees.
In a subcommittee. Yeah. So in effect, in essence, what you had was only 3 members of the House actually voted against it. But that ended up being enough to kill the legislation and keep it from going forward, where the full House of Delegates could have considered it and discussed it. It's a legislation that I'm optimistic at some point we will get. We're making progress, and I think the support is building for it, and hopefully we can get that done before the redistricting occurs in 2011.
I was going to say that's a major issue in terms of the redistricting, because it not only impacts the General Assembly, but it also impacts our congressional delegation and the like. Now, whether they would fall under the exact same rules, I'm not sure. But, we're seeing the 11th district now, which was a good over 10 years ago, was redistricted. It's actually been redistricted twice, but it was redistricted to make it more Republican at the time. Now the demographics have changed to more or less, I think, put it back into the Democratic column. We'll see this coming November. but it would be a welcome change just to have districts that were a little drawn more fairly and drawn to reflect geographics.
Drawn in a way that is logical, so that what we don't need is an approach that says we're going to have districts heavily tilted towards Democrats or districts heavily tilted towards Republicans, or we're going to make everything a 50-50 district. None of those really works. What you need is to have communities of interest and have things so that people are getting fair representation, because they're able to elect someone who adequately represents the entire district, rather than have a piece of the district that is totally removed from other parts of the district and doesn't share a commonality of interest. The legislation that was produced came forward this year that was widely supported in the Senate and killed in the House is legislation that would have created this commission. It still would have left it to the General Assembly to make changes to it if we chose to do so, but it would have at least moved the ball farther forward in terms of having a goal out there. Here's what's the best approach on things.
Sticking with the whole idea of voting in districts and the like, you had a piece of legislation. Everybody recalls the problem where we had the Springfield overpasses were all frozen.
February 12th.
Yes, and I'm sure you heard about it from some constituents.
Yes.
And now people have to realize it didn't impact the entire state.
Right.
And it impacted us up here. And there was no clear legal authority on anybody's part to keep the polls open. It struck me. I guess there could have been a request made to a judge from a political party, but there wasn't any system in place. And you sought to put a system in place.
Yes. As I'm sure most people recall, on February 12th, when we had the presidential primary, huge turnout all over Virginia. By far the highest turnout we've ever had for a primary in Virginia. And it was tremendous participation. It was great to see enthusiasm in both parties as people came out to support candidates and try to really take a step and a role in the process. What was discouraging to a lot of people was the fact that there were tens of thousands of voters in Northern Virginia who did not get to vote because of what happened to the roads when everything iced over, starting about 3 p.m. that afternoon. Polls closed at 7. So there were a lot of people who were stuck in traffic, some for as many as 6, 7, and 8 hours without being able to move, particularly on the bridges and the overpasses and the interchanges and some of the exit ramps there. When an election goes on in Richmond at the State Board of Elections, there's a secretary of the State Board of Elections who's there with her staff, but she also has 5 attorneys. Someone from the Attorney General's office is there. She has 2 staff attorneys of her own. Someone from the Democratic Party is there. Someone from the Republican Party is there. All these people who were stuck on the traffic were calling down to the State Board of Elections on their cell phone saying, please extend the hours. I really want to vote now. I'm so excited about this election. I want to vote this year. Please let us extend the hours so we can go vote. She checked with all 5 attorneys, and they all agreed that she had no ability to do that. So unfortunately, that legislation was needed, and hopefully we can get it passed next year.
I'm sure we'll see it again. First, let me thank you. Congratulate you on a successful session. Thank you for being with us today. We'll be back in 1 week. Our guest is going to be Delegate Brian Moran. Good night.